Hi, today I'm going to speak about individual responsibility, social norms, and social movements in addressing some of the challenges that we've discussed in the Nexus. I'm going to start by covering the last couple slides from last class, which just make the link between public opinion and public policy. And then I'll discuss individual responsibility vis-a-vis systems change and the relationship between the two, as well as introduce the concepts of social norms, social tipping points, and systems change. So last class, we spoke a bit about public opinion on climate change and environmental problems and partisan divergences in these opinions. We also spoke about the different factors that shape public opinion. So we spoke about messaging from elite politicians or climate scientists or from one's own social network, and also the impacts of extreme weather and direct experience of these changing environmental conditions. Now, what we're going to do is speak briefly about whether there's evidence that public opinion shapes policy. And so there are three primary types of political behavior that political scientists consider. These are turnout, this is who turns out to vote and who abstains; vote choice, who do the people who turn out to vote for and why; and collective action and protest. And so this is thinking about climate strikes or phone calls to congresspeople. On the left is a study that shows that correlates the share of state residents that believe in anthropogenic climate change with the number of climate change policies adopted by a state. And so what we see here is that there does seem to be a tight relationship between public opinion or public concern and policy adoption. What we see on the right, though, is that there are also large gaps in politicians' awareness of the priorities of their constituencies. And so here is estimated support for various liberal policies by Democratic and Republican staffers. And what we see is, anything to the left indicates an underestimation of support. And what we see is a large underestimation of support by Republicans. And importantly, we see this for example, regulation of carbon emissions as a pollutant. And so this suggests a need for greater civic engagement in order to express that these are actually much more popular policies and that there is more concern, at least than is estimated by policymakers. Okay, so we see that public opinion shapes policy. There's some evidence of this. Policy frames or narratives also create different politics and different publics. And so, for example, we spoke about this with mitigation adaptation. So if mitigation focuses on immediate individual costs for future benefits, so it creates this intergenerational prisoner's dilemma, or highlights the intergenerational trade-offs of who's paying and who's benefiting, whereas adaptation policies tend to be more popular because they benefit individuals in the here and now, and often individuals who have just experienced extreme weather of some form or other, or a natural disaster. And so we spoke a bit about how highlighting the co-benefits and linkages between the two might increase the popularity of mitigation policies. Here, we're focusing instead on different frames that have been used to think about which actors are responsible for change. And so let's compare the first two here. So the first frame comes from the Carbon Majors report, which highlighted that 100 companies have been the source of more than 70% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions since 1988. The second frame is from an academic paper that is focused on behavior change, and they motivate the paper by saying that consumer demand and supporting industries are responsible for 80% of CO2 emissions in the US. The third frame is focused on individuals, but highlights the fact that different individuals are differently responsible for emissions, and specifically that this relates to class. And so that wealthy individuals or individuals in the global north emit much more than the rest of the world or the rest of the populations in those countries. So these different frames kind of shift the focus of responsibility for emissions. So here's a question for you. If we were in person, we would do this as a poll or as a clicker question. But for now, just please try and think about what your own perspective on these questions are. How important do you think individual behavior change or climate action by individuals is to addressing the challenges of the environmental nexus? And which do you think is more important, individual behavior change or systems change? Sorry, this should say behavior change here. Another question is, if you think behavior change is important, which behaviors do you think need to be changed? And so in recent years, there have been many lists that try and highlight for individuals which types of behavior change would be most effective. For example, many of these lists highlight transportation decisions. So the decision to take a transatlantic flight, the decision to drive a car instead of taking public transit. These are high emitting behaviors. Other lists have really highlighted the impact of reproductive decisions. And so this is because the way that this is calculated is that if you have a child, that child will emit over the course of their lifetime, and they'll also have children, subsequent children that will emit as well. And so some portion of those emissions are attributed to you. And this becomes a very high emitting activity because of the many generations that follow. And there are many debates around this. There are also ethical issues with grouping reproductive behaviors alongside all these other types of behaviors, or focusing on population issues, which have been notoriously misused and misrepresented by environmental movements over the years. There are also some people arguing that the way that the future emissions are calculated don't take into account that systems, the infrastructural systems and policies will change so that future children will most likely emit less than people alive today. And so that these estimates are overestimating the impacts. Anyway, there's a lot of debate around whether we should consider reproductive decisions in these types of, when we think about the types of behaviors that individuals have agency over in terms of affecting, mitigating climate change. But this is something, if you're interested in, please email me and I'll send you more readings about this. Okay, so I'm going to start with a little bit of recent history. So the post-war period created the conditions for the emergence of a modern consumer society. There was a much wealthier middle class, in part because of policies like the GI Bill and the Marshall Plan. There was a large expansion of industrial capacity and technological developments. So for example, supermarkets grew dramatically during this period, as did single-use packaging and plastics. Some have attributed this to a deliberate effort by companies to increase consumption. In 1953, the Vermont state legislature passed a ban on disposable glass bottles. This was accompanied by growing concern about litter and pollution. The packaging industry saw this as a threat and formed an organization called Keep America Beautiful. This included Coca-Cola, Dixie Cups, among other companies. So they decided to get ahead of this crisis and shift the focus from where bottles come from to what individuals do with bottles. And environmental organizations that were also concerned about pollution joined as advisors. So for example, the Sierra Club was part of this organization. And so they developed a campaign which they took to schools and broadcast on air that had the slogan, "Every litter bit hurts." And it featured Susan Spotless, who you see on the ad on the left, who's a little white middle-class girl dressed in all white who chastises irresponsible adults for littering. And so it brings in this kind of intergenerational motivation to protect the environment. By the 1960s, over 1/3 of Americans were members of the organization, and no other laws like the Vermont law were passed. So people had really internalized the responsibility. And so let's watch one of these ads.
It happens in the best of places, best of families.
Daddy, you forgot. Every litter bit hurts.
Right, Susan Spotless? Every litter bit thoughtlessly dropped blemishes a bit of America. Our highways, our streets, our picnic spots. Keeping America beautiful is a family affair. Keep your highways handsome. Carry a litter bag in the car and use it. Keep your streets neat by using a litter basket. Keep your parks pretty. Put that litter in its place. Remember, be on guard against unconscious littering. As Susan Spotless says, keep America beautiful. Make it a family project.
Please, please, don't be a litter bug, 'cause every litter bit hurts.
Okay, so we see this appeal to also family values. So in the second half of the 60s, with the growing counterculture and anti-consumerism movements and growing concern about pollution more broadly, Keep America Beautiful adapted their campaign. And so during this period, they released the infamous Crying Indian ad, which this is a picture of it on the left, which showed an Indigenous man paddling a canoe surrounded by smokestacks and pollution, followed by the slogan, "Some people have a deep abiding respect for the deep natural beauty that was once this country, and some people don't. People start pollution and people can end it." So the message that this mess is our responsibility was one that was largely internalized by Americans in this period. In 2004, British Petroleum hired the public relation firm Ogilvy and Mathers to improve its image, in part by conveying the message that consumers of oil and natural gas bear the responsibility for their greenhouse gas emissions. And so they released this carbon footprint calculator, which allowed individuals to estimate the carbon footprints associated with their daily activities. So a recent New York Times article criticizing the creation of this kind of these carbon footprint calculators and this focus on individual responsibility compares addressing climate change, or brings up the issue of addressing ozone depleting chemicals. And in this article, the author says, imagine if in response to the expansion of the ozone hole, businesses and governments had said, we'll just hope businesses do the right thing. Instead, international policymakers created the Montreal Protocol, which sets standards that phased out ozone-destroying chlorofluorocarbons and their use worldwide. And the author ends by saying, we need more of that approach, citizens, businesses, and governments working together to address this crisis. Another quote by an academic at Stanford says that as long as fossil fuels are the basis for the energy system, you could never have a sustainable carbon footprint. You simply can't do it. So you see that these two quotes, the one from the New York Times article and the one written here, are really challenging this notion of individual responsibility relative to systems change. So within a system that is highly dependent on fossil fuels, there is little that individuals can do. The change needs to come from a coordinated and binding international effort. Okay, so there are many companies that are also, so there's this focus on individual responsibility, and there's also a lot of public pushback against corporations that are seen as highly polluting, and public image matters a lot to these corporations. And so there are many companies that are currently pledging to go carbon neutral as well. But many studies have looked at whether this is backed up with strategic advocacy, with pressure on government or policymakers to actually address climate change. And so what this figure shows here is a list of many companies. This is only a subset of the companies that were analyzed. And it shows the amount of money given to climate obstructionists, the amount of money given to individuals in the middle, and the amount of money given to climate supporters in politics by companies. So what we see is that for many companies, much more money is given to climate obstructionists. And an interesting pattern is that they often donate to both. And then another thing we see is that companies that have made public statements about their concern about the environment, so for example, Amazon or Walmart also still donate substantially to climate obstructionists. So today there are many appeals to individual responsibility and climate action in the form of list of behaviors that are ranked by impact. This has sort of replaced the public service announcement model. And we can see here again that reproductive decisions tower over other behaviors that include, again, transportation decisions, insulation, dietary choices. Okay. So let's go through some of the arguments against this focus on individual responsibility. Okay, so some of these arguments have stated that the focus on individual behavior shift the blame from corporations to individuals and obscure the fact that we're in this mess because of a neoliberal economic system that also promotes individualism at a time when what we need is collectivism, a sense of collective action, and that the collective outcomes are important. It also ignores class politics, the fact that there are wealthy individuals who emit a lot, and there's the rest of the population that doesn't really emit that much, relatively speaking. They also the focus on individual responsibility is seen to be at odds with the need for a systemic change. So a change of for example, the economic or political system. These are also often seen as palliative measures that would make little difference and that distract from political action or demands for systems change again. And so this idea of the single action bias is that people taking one action can kind of crowd out other ones. You feel like you've already done your part. And so doing something like picking up litter might mean that you don't do something like not taking a flight, but it might also mean that you don't take political action, which is one of the most important things individuals can do. Some also point out that these lists scare people away from environmental movements, especially those who see the demands as infringement on individual freedoms or civil liberties. So this focus on individual responsibility implies the need for individual change, and this scares individuals away. But there are also many reasons why the behaviors and perceptions of individuals are important. So this complicated figure on the right is from a recent paper that tries to include dynamic behavioral responses in a climate model called C-ROADS. This is the Climate Rapid Overview and Decision Support Model. Typically, models include economic and social costs and impacts, but not the feedback from behavior, from the actions of different individuals, not behavioral details. Here, the authors include a model of individual actors who experience extreme weather events. So thinking about what we spoke about last class, these individuals experience extreme weather events, and this induces perceptual and behavioral changes, which in turn impact the emissions behaviors of individuals, and which in turn impacts projections of climate change. They find that perceived social norms and efficacy of behaviors have substantial impacts on projected temperature changes, increasing the variability by up to 2.4 degrees. Okay, so this is a quote from the last IPCC, not the most recent IPCC report, the one before, which states that pathways limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius require rapid and far-reaching transitions in energy, land, urban, and infrastructure, including transport and buildings and industrial systems. These systems transitions are unprecedented in terms of scale, but not necessarily in terms of speed, and imply deep emissions reductions in all sectors, a wide portfolio of mitigation options. Many of these require some form of behavioral change or acceptance or political support or pressure on political actors. So the Net Zero America project, which Professor Pakala will speak about in a subsequent lecture, is a detailed set of pathways for achieving a net zero America by mid-century. And these pathways also entail countless individual choices. whether forced by regulation or voluntary. So for example, by 2040, light duty vehicle sales will have to be 60 to 100% electric vehicles, depending on the scenario we're considering. If regulations don't force this change, a combination of subsidies and behavioral shifts will have to happen, and most likely all of these will happen. This also extends to dietary choices. So Professor Pacala has mentioned the need for a shift away from meat-based diets towards plant-based diets. And so here what we see is a projection of decreasing global meat consumption between 2025 and 2040, in part offset by vegan and lab-grown meats. But dietary choices don't just depend on available alternatives or taste. They depend on cultural practices and traditions that can be difficult to shift with price mechanisms alone. And so these shifts will require strong political will, but also social will. And these cultural factors shouldn't be overlooked. And there are many case studies kind of highlighting why using market-based solutions or incentives or focusing on the politics and ignoring the social factors and cultural factors lead to unexpected and unwanted outcomes. Okay, so arguments in favor of individual action include the observation that some behavioral changes are needed, for example, the move to plant-based diets. These individual actions also have a signaling function. So individuals who are concerned about the environment and shift their behaviors might signal to the broader public that these are important actions and that they're urgent. There's a consistency, the desire to act consistently with one's values. The idea that actions amplify messages. This is again the kind of signaling component or signaling contribution of these behaviors. We eat more often than we vote. So these are behaviors that are done a lot. And so through their aggregate impact might have, through their aggregation might have a big impact. And that there are moral obligations to not cause others avoidable harm. So this comes up in discussions of the ethics of individual behavior and a focus on individual responsibility. That there might actually be spillover effects instead of crowding out effects. So one behavior might actually beget more behaviors, and many studies show that there are correlations between the adoption of rooftop solar and electric vehicles, for example. This might happen through the formation of identities around these behaviors, thinking of yourself as a pro-environmental individual. Once you have that kind of identity structure, this might bleed over into many different types of behaviors. And finally, the individual action actually builds collective action and highlights the problems that we should focus our collective efforts on. Okay, so these arguments, this X does not represent that these arguments don't make sense. All of these arguments make sense and carry some weight. And this is, which way you fall, whether you think that there's been too much of a focus on individual responsibility and behavior change or too little. It's a subjective question. But one thing I want to highlight is that this is sort of this focus on individual responsibility versus systems change, and this negative and positive creates this kind of false binary around the need for behavior change. And across the divides, across the anti and pro, the prominent anti and pro positions, there's often consensus that the most important thing individuals can do is create conditions for collective action, to vote or to pressure governments and other decision makers for systemic change. And this might start as local change. And so the climatologist Michael Mann says that the single biggest way to have an impact on climate change and other environmental crises is through collective pressure on policymakers to act in our interest rather than special interests. But of course, this collective pressure comes from many individual decisions that are collectively pointed at certain policies or at certain political figures. The activist Bill McKibben says that the most important thing people can do is come together to form movements or join existing groups that can push for changes big enough to matter, from citywide renewable energy programs to large-scale divestment from fossil fuels. So again, this focus on individuals coming together to form these movements that can create this collective pressure that can lead to change by governments and at higher levels, but still this change is driven by bottom-up desires. So collective action. So we see that the argument for and against individual action creates this kind of binary where individual choices and collective actions are intimately linked. Individual choices and individual actions are a precursor to collective action, and collective action is in turn a precursor for systems change. And so we can start to think of these dynamics as interlinked and all an important part of solving some of the issues we've discussed in this class. Okay, so we've discussed how many of the challenges with the Nexus are collective action problems. So these are social dilemmas where individuals would be better off overall if they cooperated, but each one faces incentives to deviate from the cooperative equilibrium. And we discussed many different features of these problems that create collective action problems. We also discussed various solutions that can help maintain cooperative individuals. So individuals can collectively commit to a certain action so that a cost is shared and benefits are distributed. They can also establish governance structures, institutions to facilitate coordination and cooperation. And I think in upcoming class, we'll discuss these governance challenges and issues in a bit more detail. Okay, so institution is a word that can mean pretty much anything. In the broadest sense, it refers to mechanisms that organize social interactions. This can include formal institutions. These are institutions that are backed by an authority, such as a government or the church. They can be informal, and this includes culture, customs, norms, unwritten societal rules. And institutions can be deliberately created. We can say, for example, we need an institution that's going to protect the rights of future generations. And this is something that Kim Stanley Robinson discusses in a recent fictional science fiction book called The Ministry of the Future. They can also be emergent. They can evolve by disaggregated social interactions and feedbacks that lead to that lead eventually to more rigid institutions. And so norms and culture, the way that they normally emerge slowly over long time horizons. So social norms, I'm going to focus a little bit on social norms because they've been applied a lot to environmental problems, and it's a growing area of research as well. So social norms are informal rules governing societies. They've been called the kind of grammar of society. And there are two types of norms. One are descriptive norms. This is what people typically do. And then there are injunctive norms. And this is what people typically think should be done. Okay. So social norms refer to the fact that people tend to conform to others. And this reinforces norms. So people have a tendency to conform to what those around them are doing. They tend to look to others for cues about how to act. This might be because of the complexity of the problem. So what other people are doing can act as a kind of heuristic or a guide in a otherwise complex situation. It might also be because there are certain, because of wanting to belong to a group and actions that shift away from the group can actually result in sanctions. So like ostracism, for example, someone who's seen to be deviant from what the group norms are can face social repercussions, like being left out of social activities. And then there are also certain behaviors that benefit from coordination. And so you can think of, so social media as a classic example. Facebook or Instagram or TikTok wouldn't be really appealing if there were very few people on them. You need some critical mass for them to be appealing. So this is a kind of coordination problem where you need enough people to coordinate on the same technology for it to become appealing. And so electric vehicles have also been highlighted as this type of technology, because the more people you have adopting electric vehicles, the more of the infrastructure you need, like charging stations. And so those are called coordination problems normally. So informal institutions like social norms can coordinate behavior where formal institutions fail or are missing. There's a large literature on private governance, so the role of norms and also of corporations in kind of filling the gap when you see insufficient regulation from governments. And some of this work on the role of informal institutions has been applied to groundwater management. So the management of groundwater is very difficult because groundwater aquifers often cross legislative boundaries. And so they can cross state boundaries, they can cross country boundaries, they can cross county boundaries, and they're also difficult to measure or to regulate. And so often there's a big role for social norms and creating, in monitoring how people use this common resource. Changing social norms. So one thing we'll talk about in the next few slides is how social norms actually change. Changing social norms can upend existing practices and pressure formal governing bodies. And so we've seen that with, for example, the movement around same-sex marriage or the suffrage movement, but also with more mundane behaviors like smoking. We also see that social norms can both be an engine for positive changes or virtuous behaviors that we'd like to see, but they can also hold in place vicious behaviors because you're conforming to the behaviors you see around you. And so studies have looked at how social norms can actually promote corruption, overconsumption. And it's true that current norms are often unsustainable. So in the context of climate change and the environment, we have this sort of disconnect between the existing norms and the norms we would like to see. Okay, so we already discussed this prisoner's dilemma problem and how this one's over. So we had pollution and pollute and abate, two companies deciding whether to pollute, abate. This one is now deciding whether to overconsume a resource, a commons resource, let's say water, for example, or to limit consumption. And we discussed why overconsume ends up being the Nash equilibrium here. And so it ends up being the equilibrium that people default to in the absence of external regulation. And this is strategic considerations and self-interested utility maximization result in this outcome of overconsumption. Formal institutions and social norms can maintain cooperative equilibria. So they can shift the equilibrium to this state where both individuals are limiting their consumption. They can do this through norms. And what norms do is they can actually shift these incentives here, because you can now, if you deviate from this cooperative equilibrium, you can face what we just spoke about, different kinds of sanctions, social sanctions. They might also, if you have pro-social preferences, so you actually care about the outcomes of the broader group, this actually might change the incentive structure so that now limiting consumption is more rewarding because you also care about what's happening to the, the strategic interaction that is a competitive one becomes more of a cooperative one. And so you care also about what's happening to other individuals in the dilemma. So there, as I mentioned, there are many recent and growing examples of social norms applied to shifting pro-environmental behaviors. And there are many organizations that have taken advantage of these social dynamics and introduced what they call social norm nudges. So for example, what you see here on the left is O-Power, which is a company that works with utilities, added information to people's bills about how they compare to their neighbors. And so what we see here on the top is an individual who's doing a little bit better than all of their neighbors, but doing worse then they're very efficient neighbors. And then they get this injunctive kind of statement as well. So you're doing good, you're not doing great, but you're doing good. And so this was added to energy bills and has also been used in the context of water conservation. And what these studies find is that people are very receptive to how they're doing relative to others, and information about what others around them are doing can lead individuals to conserve more energy and water. They also find these kind of backlash effects where if you're doing better than everyone else, you might actually start doing worse. And so there's strategic ways in which this information is communicated to avoid these boomerang effects. The I voted stickers are another example. So these were initially introduced in contexts with low turnout to encourage people to vote through social pressure. And so what this does is make an invisible behavior visible. And it puts people's reputation now at stake. If you believe that voting is an important thing and you're not, you see many people around you wearing this sticker, you might be encouraged to vote because many people are doing it, or also because you want to signal that you voted, or because you want to be part of the group that has voted. So it creates this kind of social pressure and makes the social norm that many people do in fact vote visible. The visibility of pro-environmental behaviors is particularly important for climate change. So one challenge for collective action around climate change is that people don't feel comfortable speaking about the topic. So the Yale Communications group found that 7 in 10 Americans rarely or never discuss climate change, though a large and growing fraction of the population is concerned about climate change. So this is because people systematically underestimate this concern about climate change. So even though there's a growing concern among the general public, people underestimate this concern. And these second order beliefs, so these are beliefs about the beliefs of others, can lead to self-silencing. And self-silencing can erode collective action and create what the theoretical literature is called a spiral of silence. And so this is what you see on this figure here. So on the right, this is the number of people who are unwilling to express a minority opinion. And so if you're low on unwilling, it means more people are likely to express the minority opinion. They're less constrained in what they're saying. On the right is a situation where many people are unwilling to express what they view as a minority opinion. So for example, concern about the environment. Here, what you see is the how strong you think the majority position is. So this is your belief about how much people care about climate change, like how strong do you think that view is in the population? And so what we find is people have a high view that people don't care. So the minority position is that people care. They're also much less willing to talk about climate change or their own concern. And so this can erode collective action because people aren't aware that other people care, and so that they don't know that there's this collective energy. And these misperceptions, as we discussed, extend to experts and political elites' beliefs about their constituencies. And so this can lead to political inaction on topics where politicians or policymakers don't think that their constituencies care. And you can see how this can become a self-perpetuating cycle because people are also not speaking about these issues because of this spiral of silence. So they're not correcting these misperceptions among politicians or policymakers. Another important feature of social norms is that they travel through social networks. So social norms, you have these examples where you have these companies that create these messages that are distributed to everyone's home. But in general, the way that you learn about social norms is by interactions with people around you. And so social norms travel through social networks, and social networks can be connected in many different ways. And the structure, the way that they're connected, can affect how social norms spread. And it can also create polarization in views, or it can, if everyone's very well connected, like in these kinds of random or distributed networks here, then views might move quickly and people, a norm will kind of move across the system instead of existing in small clusters. These figures also show that some people's actions and views may matter more than others. This is what are called central nodes in this literature. And so, for example, someone like Greta Thunberg, who has a very big platform on social media, but also on news media, and is this public figure, her actions might be particularly important in terms of reaching a bigger public. Okay, and so this just depicts how network structures can also be highly divisive, and if this maps onto, for example, the political ideologies of individuals, they can also create these kind of segregated networks, and so norms don't spread as easily across polarized groups or segregated groups. So scholars or academics studying the spatial spread of rooftop solar in Germany noticed an interesting pattern. So researchers were puzzled that adoption was sort of slow, even though there had been plummeting prices in rooftop solar. And what they noticed is that the adoption of rooftop solar spreads spatially in a systematic way. And so it spreads at first slowly from house to house, eventually increasing speed until a neighborhood is covered. And what they also noticed is that once a neighborhood's covered, you can end up with these boundary effects. So one neighborhood might have adopted a lot of rooftop solar, but the neighborhood across a big divide, like a highway, will not have adopted the rooftop solar. And so this just emphasizes these kinds of network effects, and the visibility of those behaviors around you can be really important for your own decision. And where there are breaks in those connections, you can see that the behavior, the value, the opinion might not travel so easily. So social norms are particularly popular or a big area of study in climate change research because they're a powerful driver of behavior. And there's theory showing that very small local changes can lead to rapid and widespread shifts that create social tipping points. And I believe Professor Nixon has mentioned social tipping points in an earlier class. So social tipping points were originally studied in the context of protests or strikes. Historical data shows that a small critical group of people that's very committed to a view or committed to a particular belief has the power to shift the values or behaviors of the population through these kinds of conformity pressures. And so, for example, the way that this has been described in the literature is that the cost-benefit ratio of striking, so deciding to leave work and go on a strike, depends on the number of others that are striking as well, because you're less likely to be punished as an individual if that happens. So this is the power of collective protest. And so if there's a very committed set of individuals who are willing to withstand, for whom the costs are lower because the benefits are so great, this can lead other individuals for whom the benefits, who are less committed to this cause but still care about it, to join the strike as more and more people join, because they see that the cost benefit ratio of joining is decreasing. So this is one of the original ways in which these kinds of social tipping dynamics were studied, is this formation of protests, strikes, these kinds of social movements. You can also think about this in the context of technology adoption, which I mentioned before, which is that the costs of adopting a new technology are decreasing in the number of other people that have adopted it. And so they're returns to scale and or coordination benefits. If more and more people adopt a certain behavior for certain types of behaviors, this can lead other people to want to adopt them as well, because it actually decreased the costs of those behaviors. And so these kinds of dynamics, this spreading, these committed individuals, and how this can sort of shift the norms. So you have more people joining those protests, people that were a little bit on the fence see this energy, join these protests. This can lead to the rapid emergence of new norms. And so this is something that has recently become a focus of a lot of research on the role of individuals and collective dynamics on policy, on pressure on politicians, and leading to this kind of systemic change. And so this is where we can see the relationship. Okay, and so this figure on the right, I won't go into it in too much detail, but it's from empirical, some experimental studies showing that the size of the committed minority that you need in order to lead a society to tip from one norm to the other norm. And so this is a stylized game. We don't need to go into the details, but this study finds that once you have about a 25, over a 20% committed minority, then you tend to see the changes shifting through a society. And this committed minority, who is this committed minority? This committed minority might come from generational shifts. So we see that younger generations and younger millennials, for example, are very committed and vocal about action on climate change. And we see this in the Fridays for Future strikes. And a committed minority like this can lead other generations who have, who have less worry to see this as a bigger problem and join forces. Migration can also lead to similar, so an influx of individuals with different priorities or different values, different beliefs that are committed to those beliefs can also create similar kinds of tipping points. So these social processes can lead to social movements. Social movement theorists generally point to 4 stages: the emergence, where the problem is identified and mobilization happens; the coalescence, as the movement reaches a critical mass for collective action; institutionalization, as the movement becomes a more formal movement and starts to actually impact politics and policy outcomes, or where new institutions are formed to represent this social movement; and then decline. So social movements are really diverse. They can take the form of peaceful or nonviolent protests or other collective acts like letter writing. They can spring up around the globe, or they can be focused on local needs. They can be single or multi-issue. They can be planned or emergent. So for example, the Cochabamba water wars that Professor Nixon discussed, and the recent protests around privatization of water in Chile are more local in their focus than, for example, the Fridays for Future global protests against climate change more generally. Social movements can also resist change, for example, as shown here with the yellow vests, which we've already discussed, protesting fuel hikes, or various local protests against wind farms across the US. And so people tend to support policies when they're further away in time or space and when they're cheaper. And starting to think about the local implementation of policies requires considering how a policy will actually impact you and your community. And this can depend on ideology, but also material factors, how for example, installation of wind turbines is going to affect property values, or how it's going to harm wildlife. And so you end up with these protest groups that can come from very diverse sides of the political spectrum and have very diverse priorities, but who see a cost associated with the expansion of this policy. So local resistance, or what are often, you can call this NIMBY protests. These are not in my backyard, and this is a big deal for siting of wind projects, both on and offshore. We've seen this in the US with many local protests, also for the siting of toxic facilities. And so, these aren't necessarily a bad thing, but there's something that has to be considered with policy implementation. There's also YIMBY movements. These are yes in my backyard. And so, for example, in the UK, wind turbines have been associated with transfers of wealth to farming families and rural landowners who get paid for the use of their land, for a large portion of the land that's used to construct wind turbines. And so these transfers have led to broad support for these policies, at least among wealthier landowners. So both business as usual and transition scenarios have winners and losers, which creates social and political barriers to change, but potentially also opportunities once those are identified. And so this figure on the right, again, from the Net Zero America project, shows the net loss or gains in jobs across states, but also how those gains and losses are distributed across different parts of the energy sector. And so this will have implications for different people. Intersectional policy and governance that emphasizes equity, job creation, and retraining or compensation for those affected can build coalitions and broaden support. And so this figure here is from a study looking at how the introduction of social, economic, and different features of a policy affect its support. And so any point on the right indicates that that feature increased support with respect to the reference category in bold, and any point on the left indicates that it decreased support. And so what we see is that the size of the policy, how much it's going to cost, bigger sizes decrease support relative to a 100 billion per year, a policy that costs 100 billion per year across the board. We also see that including other social dimensions, so affordable housing, health insurance, minimum wage, free college, increases support, and that job guarantees and measures to retrain fossil fuel workers also increase support for environmental policies. So for example, for carbon tax policy. The other thing that we see is that, so this, you can think about how the revenues of these taxes are redistributed. If there are social and economic provisions, we see that this increases support. The other thing we see is that there are stark differences between how this affects support among Republicans in red and Democrats. But there does seem to be general agreement that introducing these economic measures like jobs guarantee programs or retraining programs can increase support among both. And also when the sponsor of the policy, when there's bipartisan sponsorship of the policy, this can increase support dramatically among Republicans relative to a Democratic sponsor. So these are these partisan kind of messenger effects that are really important. Okay, and this is the last slide. The Council of the Mice is one of Aesop's fables that tells the story of a group of mice that meet to figure out how to deal with the threat of a roaming cat. And one proposes placing a bell around the cat's neck so they can hear when it's approaching. The plan's applauded, all the mice love this plan until one mouse asks, but who's going to volunteer to place the bell on the cat? And this is the moral of this fable, is that a plan needs to be evaluated not only on its desirability, but also on how feasible it is and how it can be executed or implemented. And that's what these last two classes have in part been about, the kinds of political barriers that we should be considering and the social barriers that we should be considering, and how we can think about promoting collective action or making it more salient for people. Thank you.